A little while ago I made a model of a what you can use loosely called Dark Age warrior, and I called him Ossa of the Knife because he's an interesting character who got recruited into Arthurian legend, but before that happened he seems to have been a real leader of a war band who were mercenaries who got deposited up in Northumbria sometime in the early 400s. And during that model I said I'll probably have to explain Northumbria because it's quite odd. So here goes, let's try and understand Northumbria. Northumbria was a Dark Age kingdom in Britain, because after the Romans kind of faded away at the end of the 300s into the early 400s, Britain kind of fragmented. That sounds very negative. It split up into a large number of small kingdoms, but Northumbria very quickly became a very big kingdom, and that's one reason to have a good look at it. These days I live in the modern county of Northumberland, which isn't quite the same thing. Northumberland, the county, is a very long way from the Humber. The Humber being a wide river which runs from the Pennines in the central section of northern England, and it runs eastwards out into the North Sea, and as it does so it widens dramatically. Back in the Dark Ages it was known as the Humber Sea. It's tidal, it's salty, it's massive, and it divides southern England from northern England, at least on the eastern side, and they could easily be two very different worlds and rarely ever meet. So Northumbria was a kingdom which stretched all the way down to there. Northumberland, the county, is the kind of remaining stump of that ancient kingdom. To define it is very hard because it had a lifespan of around 400 years where it was incredibly successful, and from the beginning it was small, but it grew and expanded dramatically. So probably have to start at the beginning when it isn't Northumbria at all. The core of Northumbria is a very ancient kingdom which a Dark Age writer, Bede, called Bernicia. He said he was tidying up an ancient word that was very hard to say, and that word is something like Brynaiach, and that itself may be a slightly modern version of something that was far older, because Brynaiach or Bernicia was a small Dark Age kingdom on the northeast coast of England, what is now England, and it lay between the River Tweed, which is the present border between England and Scotland, and then it runs south from there to the River Tyne, and it's along the Tyne that the Romans built Hadrian's Wall. So you have this area, the most northerly county of England these days, but which was once a kingdom in its own right. Didn't really have capitals and things like that, but people kind of used that word loosely. Its capital was at Bamborough, which now has a medieval castle on top of it, and that was then souped up in the Victorian period. So that seems to have been a part of the government structure of this kingdom. There were other places, like a place called Geoffrey, which had a palace, which could also claim to be something like a capital. Anyway, there's this small kingdom, Brynaiach or Bernicia, which expanded and expanded and swallowed up other kingdoms. And that's what eventually reaches right down to the Humber. And from that point it can call itself Northumbria, the land north of the Humber. It sort of has its roots in ancient Celtic, pre-Roman tribal zones. There was, when the Romans turned up in the 60s AD. The interesting thing is the Romans claimed to have conquered Britain in 43, but they didn't get to the Humber really until about 68 and cross it, so that took a while. And then eventually they managed to get up into what we now call Scotland, and had a few battles and claimed that the tribes had submitted to them, which is a bit hard to back up, because the tribes are almost permanently fighting against them. The way the Romans claimed to have conquered Britain was, after the biggest of those battles, they sailed a ship around the northern tip of Scotland. I could ride a bike round North America. It doesn't make me Donald Trump. So that's how the Romans sort of came up, encountered various tribes and intentionally misunderstood them so they could go around conquering them and say they'd done the right thing. And they encountered the Votadini, who were quite a large tribe. And large Celtic tribes often divide themselves up into sub-tribes, very often into units of 3, and the Votadini seem to have done that. The Votadini themselves were around Edinburgh and the Firth of Forth up in Scotland. Then the second section is now what's called the Lothians, which is named after a Celtic god, Lu or Lee or Lug or Luch or whatever. Anyway, so the Lothians still kind of bear that name, and they run down to the river Tweed, which is, as I just said, the modern border between England and Scotland. So that's been a border of some standing for a very long time. Then below the Tweed is this Bernicia Bruneiac place. So it's part of a very old Celtic structure, and Bruneiac is definitely not an Anglo-Saxon English name, it's Celtic British. So it's the language the people were speaking long before the English arrived and long before the Romans arrived. It's the British tongue. So interesting that what's supposed to be an Anglo-Saxon Dark Age kingdom keeps an old British title, Bruneiac. So that's our geography. Once the Romans have gone, things start to clear a little. So the Romans go, some people say around about 410, but they've been fading away for decades. And this once tribal zone starts to modernise and become a kingdom. So that's from the early 400s. What you then see is a development and a growth, and one of the reasons it's really important to consider Northumbria is that it's not just a land of warriors conquering other kingdoms, it's a land of learned, educated people who create a phenomenal culture. Because while the history of Northumbria is often bypassed in Britain these days, it has to accept the fact that in Northumbria there was a golden age of creativity, a cultural marvel that stood out from the crowd to the point where it's been recognised by the World Heritage Organisation as a real and definable thing. Part of that are things like the monk Bede, who was a Northumbrian and who in the monastery at Jarrow proved the world was an orb. Sorry those people who think it's flat. He also was the first man to truly understand how the tides worked, and he did a good few other scientific things and mathematical things. He came up with a translation of the Bible which the Catholic Church deemed as the approved version until the 1960s and still holds in high esteem, and he wrote a rather marvellous history of what he titled The Church and English People, but was actually predominantly about Northumbria, which is why we know a lot about it. There's also things like the Lindisfarne Gospels. Have a look at them online. They come from this era too. So it was a phenomena. Also, across Northern Europe, these folks were so highly respected that still to this day in some monastic establishments there's Schottenkloster, which are basically, in loose terms, means Scots cloister, a place dedicated to travelling monastic educated folk, men and women, who came from this region. They called it Scots because they couldn't tell one English or one British dialect from another. They just knew they were Northern British and assumed they were Scots. So that gives you an idea of how potent this culture was. And it's all being formed during the 400s and 500s and into the 6s. And so just a brief summary of what was going on. People would say almost nothing was happening until 547, when a man called Ida seized the throne and created a dynasty that was the beginning of Northumbria. You can split hairs about terminology there, but Brynaiach clearly existed and clearly had monarchs. The records of these lie in what are called pedigrees or king's lists, and they've been preserved in Wales, strangely, because Wales is sort of the last remnant of this old British culture. So Wales is where you go to find records of many parts of Britain before the Anglo-Saxons arrived and conquered it, apparently. I don't quite go for that either, but we haven't got time for that. So what's happening is the Romans leave Britain. Apparently the Britons are vulnerable and they're attacked by pirates and seafaring raiders, the English, the Anglo-Saxons, who come from the continent. They are Germanic. They come from what we would now consider Belgium, Holland and Denmark. And they come over and they conquer the weak British and set up their own powerful kingdoms. But Brynaiach, and as it develops, Northumbria, kind of swims against that tide slightly. So it's got strong British kings who are listed in these pedigrees, and many of their names get woven into Arthurian myth, and much of the landscape around here gets woven into Arthurian myth, because Arthur is supposed to exist around about the end of the 400s and into the 5s, successfully fighting off these Anglo-Saxons from across the North Sea. 12 battles are listed as being his great victories, and a 13th is his final battle where he's killed. And you can easily place all of them in or around Brynaiach, some going up as far as the Clyde and what's now Glasgow. So he seems to have had a lot of links with the north, hence you get these characters from this region sort of gravitationally pulled into Arthurian myth. It's easy for people to dismiss Arthurian myth and the Welsh records because it's a cultural bias in England. Apparently the English, the Anglo-Saxons from across the North Sea, won. They conquered the Britons. They pushed any rebellious survivors into the West Country, Wales and Scotland, and triumphed. And so they then sneered at the Britons ever since, and that sneering pretty much continues. And it means that even if historians don't recognise they're doing it, they look down upon the records of the British, the Welsh, particularly as a lot of it was based on oral history, and so it appears to be malleable and ever evolving, so it's not a firm thing to grip onto. But then the written record, particularly a lot of the English written records, are just outright propaganda. So, you know, interesting. Pots calling kettles various shades of whatever. So it's worth looking at the British records, it's worth looking at what the Welsh have got to say. And between them and some of their mythology, which is more than mythology, you can piece together the fact that there are these powerful kings in Brunei, and they are fighting wars against Germanic intruders, let's call them. And sometimes the Germanic intruders manage to get themselves on the throne, and then they're promptly booted off again. Some of these, or probably most of these Germanic invaders, then go into exile in a southern kingdom, below what used to be Hadrian's Wall, below the River Tyne, in an area that's now sort of East Yorkshire, that was a very clearly Germanic kingdom called Deira, and that itself is expanding too. Soon it will swallow up the city of York, and it will spread and spread, and sort of fade into the Pennines to their west. So these two kingdoms eventually come face to face across the border and war with each other on a fairly regular basis. One swallows the other up. It seems as if Brunei swallows Deira up just a little bit more than vice versa. And whenever these two kingdoms are sort of forged together under one king, then of course that land will spread all the way down to the Humber, and so you get Northumbria. So Northumbria is an occasional thing, and then war will break out again, and the two kingdoms will split apart, and then one of the kingdoms will start to dominate and swallow the other up again. So that's a pattern that goes on through the 400s and into the 5s. Eventually, in 547, this character Ida that I mentioned earlier comes to the front of things. Very interesting pattern goes on around about that time, perhaps into the late 30s, 530s, or into the early 540s. Way off across the other side of the globe, Mount Ilopango explodes because it's a volcano and seems to throw an awful lot of ash into the northern hemisphere and seems to smother much of Europe. This again can be found in Arthurian myth as the wasteland, a place where kings struggle to keep their people alive and to keep the magic of life itself going in their kingdom. This is a mythological representation of a disaster. When this kind of thing happens in real life, crops die, animals die, people starve. So you have bodies lying around all over the place, not just people obviously, but cattle, sheep, the lot. And then plague breaks out. And in the middle of the 540s, there is recorded the fact that there is a plague which breaks out. Interestingly, just going back to Mount Ilopango, around about the time it breaks out, various chronicles in Ireland and Britain say things like days as dark as night. That gives you an idea of an ash cloud. So after the ash cloud, famine. After famine, weakness and plague. And it's interesting that this is when Ida comes to the fore and seems to create a new dynasty, because it looks as if the monarchs who were ruling in Brunei, who happened to synchronise with the arrival of Germanic kings from Deira, so there's been a takeover from the southern kingdom, it seems as if they are blamed for this wasteland. They are blamed for starvation and plague. This is often what happens at times like this. And so they're overthrown, and Ida is the man who comes to the fore. And he seems to represent a return to the native, indigenous people and culture. But because he did extremely well, because he founded his own dynasty, the later successful Anglo-Saxons have said, oh no, because he's a success, he must be an Anglo-Saxon. So he's got the label of being an Anglian king, creating an Anglian dynasty in an Anglian kingdom, and it's probably not the case. Anyway, he founds this dynasty. He overthrows monarchs from the southern kingdom. He welds the two kingdoms together, and so you definitely get a clear idea that Northumbria has been created, the land north of the Humber. So from then on, from the middle of the 500s, we see Ida's family line ruling in Northumbria, with occasional overthrows from that line who go into exile in Deira quite often. It's known that when Ida and his sons and grandsons swallow up Deira, that the royal families and the exiles go elsewhere in Britain, quite often into East Anglia, which is further south. And so we see them make a comeback every so often from exile and overthrowing Ida's dynasty, and then Ida's dynasty fights back. The greatest of these overthrowers from the south is a king called Edmund, who pushes his way onto the throne in 616 and creates a phenomenal sort of glorious reign. And he's actually the working model for just about every medieval monarch since then. He went around with banners and standards wherever he went. He was ostentatious in his appearance. He had massive bodyguards. So he was recreating a kind of Roman style. He was a new Roman emperor on a smaller scale. But Bede thinks he's great, and Bede writes a lot about him, and he tells us a lot, and Bede does a lot to further this image. And one of the things that Bede says, which seems to, it's not true, but it shows the difference, the impact this man is making, and that is that a woman with a newborn child could walk from one end of his kingdom to another and never be harmed. Law and order is brought to bear. Not just the rule of warrior kings, not just the whim of kings, but a condition of law and order which everybody understood and which people knew they couldn't go against. This is a step forward. This is phenomenal. He eventually is overthrown in 632, and Ida's descendants take over, and they continue. It's as if Northumbria has got a standard machinery of government by now, which Ida and his descendants have been building up, which Edmund the intruder has made the most of. And so kings can come and go. They can stab each other in the corridors of power and poison each other in banquets and so on. The machinery of government will continue. They even had an economy which produced small coins. The metal is almost of no value whatsoever. They are tokens of wealth. Everybody else, the value of their coin is based on the quantity of gold or silver in them. These are modern, sort of fiat currency almost. I know that's not popular, but think how modern this is. This is the 600s. So these folks are pushing forward. In Ida's day, he'd managed to conquer his way down to the Humber. But in Edwin's day, in the early 600s, and Ida's descendants who overthrow him, they are quite easily going to war, not with local kingdoms, but with Wessex, down on the Thames and down to the south coast. And during their reigns, they dominate all of the Germanic kingdoms, all of the English kingdoms, every one of them, except Kent, who has an interesting relationship with Bernicia. Every other English kingdom bows the knee and pays tribute every year to Northumbria, and a good few of the British kingdoms do too. The dominance that these fellows held was phenomenal, and one king of Wessex, very interesting, during a later reign of King Oswy, he's having trouble. In effect, he's a client king. He pays tribute every year to Northumbria. And so he's allowed to come up, and let me put it in modern terms, he regularly holidays up in Northumbria to get away from his scheming barons. So you can see how stable Northumbria makes much of mainland Britain. This is really surprising for these days. If you want to know more about it, read Bede. Eventually, there's some internal strife. The different branches of Ida's family war with each other, but that never seems to bother the kingdom itself, the stability, the wealth and the power. A war with the Picts does reduce the power of Northumbria somewhat, but it's always had its ups and downs. Sometimes that's a little bit overplayed. The real problem comes, let's say for round figures, in the early 800s. Supposedly because it's the Vikings who turn up, and what they do is they destroy infrastructure. Northumbria is reduced back down to being Bruneiac. It creates its own kings. Occasionally the Vikings intrude, and occasionally they get pushed out again. And it's very interesting. Apparently the first Viking raid is on Lindisfarne, one of the great monastic centres of Northumbria, on a tidal island. This isn't strictly true, because if you read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, you'll find that there were similar raids going on in Kent decades before, and the Kentish people were building walls, paying for walls to be refurbished and so on, to keep these people at bay. So it looks as if the Vikings go for a soft option, which is an undefended island full of incredible wealth, probably one of the wealthiest places in Europe at the time. And they hit that at the very end of the 700s. Once you get into the 800s, they've pretty much smashed up most of England and destroyed most of the kingdoms. But as I was saying, Bruneiac struggles on. It's weaker and it doesn't have many friends, but it certainly struggles on. And you can see that centuries later, when William the Conqueror wins the Battle of Hastings, the Norman from France, William the Conqueror, wins the Battle of Hastings in 1066, conquers England apparently. He doesn't really get this far north. Instead, when rebellions break out, he then does what's called the harrowing of the north, or the harrying of the north, which is an utter destruction, a burning of farms. It's sort of devastation, a recreation of wasteland. But they never get over the Tyne and get into this area. And then, subsequent to that, when he's having the Doomsday Book written, which is a list of every farmstead in his kingdom of England, so that he knows exactly what tax he's going to get. He's not interested in much else. There's no entry for this area in the Doomsday Book, because they just daren't go this far. At one point he did appoint a governor who was hounded out by the locals and was chased down the Tyne, and he went and hid in a church at an area that's called Newburn, that's now swallowed up by Newcastle, and he claimed sanctuary in the church, which is fair. So the locals burnt the church down, he ran out and they killed him. There is a fine Norman castle in the centre of Newcastle, that's where it gets its name from. That comes at the very end of the 1000s, when his son managed to push that far north. And if you want to know how frightened the Normans are when they're living up here, when they start building castles, look at the size of them. I'm not from this area. I come from the sort of Hertfordshire, Bedfordshire, Buckinghamshire area. Castles down there are tiddly and they don't last long. Up here they're enormous, because they're afraid of the locals for a long time to come. So that rounds off Northumbria. Hope it made sense. Hope it was in some way interesting. There's loads of other topics in there, so maybe I'll pick up on a few others and do a few more bits and pieces like this. So here we are, half an hour, would you, Adam and Eve? Thank you for listening. We may do more. See you soon.